Hello and welcome to Caerphilly Castle, a formidable fortification recognisable throughout the world and absolutely pivotal to one of the most incredible stories in British history. It concerns the downfall and assassination of a king of England, the Plantagenet king, King Edward II, a man made famous by being related to Danny Dyer out of EastEnders. But just because we're talking about a king of England, please don't think that I'm abandoning my principles of focusing on Glamorgan history, because the truth of the matter is, most of the events I should be talking to you about today took place on a bus route near you. Let me put the gravity of this story into some context. We're talking about the assassination of a king of England, and that does not happen very often. In fact, this is one of a maximum of only 8 throughout the whole of history, and that includes Saxon kings, and kings like Richard II and Edward V, where the jury is still out. And if that somehow is not spectacular enough, the mode of his death, in the best known version of the story, was from having a red-hot poker inserted rectally. The story is of a marriage rocked by sex scandals and lovers of both gay and heterosexual orientation, and it includes the most extreme jilted lover gets revenge with her ex story ever. It's enough to make the plotline of Game of Thrones look positively pedestrian. And not only that, but throughout this story you will hear me talk about what happened in places like Llantrisant, Caerphilly, Cardiff, Neath, Morien, and of course the tiny village of Llangynwyd near Maesetg. And if you live in Cardiff in, say, Mortimer Road in Pontcanna, or Clare Road or Despenser Street in Grangetown, you might be unwittingly living in the street named after one of the people at the centre of this story. But before we get stuck into the meat of that story, maybe there's a few questions we need to answer first to add a bit of context, like who exactly was Edward II? Why did he fall so spectacularly from grace, and why did it unfold here in South Wales? Edward II, also known as Edward of Caernarfon, was born in Caernarfon Castle in Gwynedd on the 25th of April 1284. He reigned from 1307 to 1327. His dad, Edward I, was a formidable warrior king. He was well over 6 foot tall, which is quite unusual in the 14th century, hence his nickname Edward Longshanks. He was also known by another nickname, the Hammer of the Scots. He was the first English king to finally bring Scotland under English control. He also crushed the last remaining principalities of Gwynedd and Ceredigion as well, thus bringing the whole of Wales under English rule too. But the cost of those wars was twofold. First off, they'd put a huge strain on the resources of England. Many men had died in battle, which had depleted the size of the English army. It was too thinly spread to defend against the inevitable backlash. And the wars had also pretty much bankrupted the country. So the first thing Edward had to do as king was levy huge taxes to refill the coffers. And that didn't go down well. We see the same pattern with other unpopular kings, like when John had to follow Richard the Lionheart, and when Henry VI had to follow Henry V. Skint and overstretched, their downfall was like a ticking time bomb. Another problem his father left him was a bunch of seething neighbours. Yes, the Welsh and the Scots and the Irish had all been defeated in battle, but they were really resentful of those defeats, and it sowed a lot of nationalistic dissatisfaction and a desire to rise up and throw out the English. That resulted in the most spectacular failure of Edward's reign, losing the Battle of Bannockburn on the 24th of June 1314. That not only saw him lose Scotland, but one of his most powerful supporters, Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Glamorgan, was also killed in battle. So he'd lost Scotland and created a power vacuum in an already volatile South Wales. But don't get me wrong, it wasn't all his father's fault. Edward also managed to spectacularly mess things up all by himself on several accounts. First, he was not particularly fair nor balanced in how he doled out patronage. He had favourites like Galveston and Despenser, and he disproportionately rewarded them, and always backed them in disputes, even if they deliberately created those disputes in the pursuit of land and wealth. That created even more resentment. Then, he made possibly the biggest error of judgment of all. Edward went to war with France, which was a tad awkward, as his long-suffering wife, Isabella, was the sister of the King of France. Edward took the ill-advised step to put her in prison on a charge of being a bit French. And to make matters worse, you'll never guess who he appointed to be her jailer. He appointed the man who owned the castle we've been at all day, Caerphilly Castle, Hugh Le Despenser the Younger, who was believed to be the king's lover. So let's just let that sink in for a minute. He put his wife in jail and he made his lover her jailer. Now that's quite awkward. How on earth did Edward ever expect to be able to recover from that? Well, the truth of the matter is that he probably didn't, and this really was the beginning of his undoing. But how did this and his many other mistakes blow up for him so badly? Political leaders mess up all the time, but they don't usually get killed for it, not even in the medieval period. But what happened here was tantamount to civil war, and it all happened so fast. And another question, why was Glamorgan the place where it happened?
Well, there are a number of factors. The early 1300s were a terrible time to be alive if you were poor, which of course most people were. There were bad harvests throughout Europe, and there was a great famine. We don't know what the situation was like exactly in Wales, but it's been estimated that maybe as many as 1 in 15 people starved to death. At the same time, they were heavily taxed. And despite the privations of the population, the king needed money. And to complicate matters, there was an inheritance dispute when Gilbert de Clare, the young Gilbert, was killed, along with several hundred other Glamorgan men at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Thereafter was a great inheritance dispute. And the problem was that one of the 3 sisters of the young Gilbert was married to a very avaricious man, Hugh Le Despenser the Younger.
Right.
And he managed to somehow or other deprive the other 2 sisters and their husbands of their inheritance. And so there was a great amount of unhappiness in South Wales, and at this time the marcher lords were of course extremely powerful, and major divisions occurred.
Yeah, sure. So why were they so powerful? What gave them all that power?
The marcher lords were given power by Edward I, and he needed them when he wanted to suppress Wales, and so he gave them more or less a free hand. And they retained a lot of that power. And they didn't want to be told what to do by the king. And this, of course, was a recipe for conflict, which came. During the period of the inheritance dispute, the lands in South Wales, the Glamorgan lands, were in the hands of the king. And the king appointed an agent in Wales, a man called Payne de Turberville, appropriately named because he was a very tough guy. And he oppressed people greatly. He insisted on collecting taxes from these desperately poor people for the king, and it is quite likely that he wanted to line his own pockets as well. This was indeed a tinderbox. All it needed was a spark. And the person who actually ignited a conflict from the spark was a man now known as Llywelyn Bren. Llywelyn Bren was from the cantref of Llangynwyd, the cantref being how the land was administered in those days. And he actually petitioned the king because he believed that the people were being pushed too hard by his agent in Wales. And he was summoned to Lincoln to see the king, but what had happened was that Payne de Turberville had denounced Llywelyn to the king. So the king said to Llywelyn, come to Lincoln to answer this charge of sedition. If we find you guilty, you'll be hanged. So he didn't go, and a rebellion ensued.
The stage was set. The stench of rebellion was in the air, and Glamorgan was the tinderbox. All it needed now was someone to light the fuse, and then all hell would break loose. 2 things we've already mentioned in passing were about to come together in quite a spectacular way, and they both concerned the king's favourite Hugh Le Despenser. Roger Mortimer had got on the wrong side of Despenser in the dispute over the earldom of Glamorgan and had absconded into voluntary exile in France. Despenser also cropped up again when I mentioned how Edward imprisoned his wife Isabella when he went to war with France, and he had appointed Despenser, his lover, to be her jailer. It's quite hard to imagine how Edward could have made his relationship with his wife any worse, but he found a way. Edward did not enjoy much success in war, so it doesn't come as much of a surprise that the war with France went the same way as all of the others and was something of a disaster. Losses in battle were thick and fast, and every time they came through they were heavy and they were humiliating. It was coming to a point where he really had no option other than to bring the whole thing to an end or risk losing his entire kingdom to the French. So he hatched a genius plan. Wait a minute, he thought. My wife Isabella is the sister of the King of France. Why don't I send her to France to lobby her brother to negotiate peace terms with England? Genius. So that's what he did. She got to France, where her brother introduced her to the exiled Roger Mortimer. They talked and bonded over their mutual disrespect for Edward and hatred for Despenser, and they became lovers. Now, we've all heard some bad breakup stories in our time. There's the one where the ex-wife gets back at her ex-husband by cutting his priceless collection of £4,000 Savile Row suits into ribbons with a razor blade. There's the one where the ex-husband, on being moved out of the former matrimonial home to make way for his ex-wife, new lover, hides prawns in the curtain poles. And you've got to respect that to a certain degree. But all of these get knocked into a cocked hat when we think about how Isabella was able to exact her revenge on her ex. On the 24th of September, 1326, Isabella, the Queen of England, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, invaded England with an army of French mercenaries. Their mission was simply this: recruit all the disgruntled barons and marcher lords into their ranks, march on London, depose Edward, and replace him on the throne with her son, the future Edward III. It was breathtakingly bold and simple. Edward's regime imploded. His lords either deserted him or stood aside, and news had reached him that Isabel and her army were approaching the outskirts of London. So he and Despenser headed to where they thought they would be safest, Despenser's estates here in Glamorgan, specifically this castle right here behind me. The last word in military power. Surely if they just kept their heads down here, they would be safe, wouldn't they? You may have recalled me mentioning previously that Edward was really not much of a military tacticianer. And when he heard that Isabella and Mortimer knew he was in Wales and were sending an army west to meet him, he and Despenser abandoned what must have been their best hope of survival, their safest bet. They left the castle at Caerphilly, and not only did they leave the castle at Caerphilly, that wasn't the only dumb thing they did. They also left the Hall of Treasure that they'd taken from London there. They also entrusted their escape route to a knight called Sir John Felton to try and plan a way for them to get to Milford Haven so they could sail off to Ireland. There was only one fly in that particular ointment, and that was John Felton was from Norfolk. He did not have a clue how to get to Milford Haven, probably didn't even know where Milford Haven was. So how do we know that? What authority do we have for this information? Well, for the story up to this point, we have a fair amount, even if most of it was written up by people who made Sir John Felton look like a local. Most of them had never heard of places like Caerphilly or knew where they were. But from the moment Edward and Despenser left Caerphilly, however, reliable information gets a bit thin on the ground, despite the fact the king himself kept a journal. But we do have some intriguing legend, most of it written hundreds of years after the event, but we really need to examine these legends to try and get a picture of what really happened. On that note, it's quite strange how much distorted legend there is about Edward II, and not just about this episode, but throughout his life. For example, Many people may have heard the story that Longshanks made a promise to the Welsh that the future Prince of Wales would not be an English speaker. Then he appointed his baby, infant son, Edward, to the role, who was too young to speak any language at all, the inference being that Longshanks had tricked the Welsh. Absolute nonsense. Longshanks had smashed the Welsh in battle and had nailed his authority down with a wall of massive castles. If he wanted to appoint his son to the rank of Prince of Wales, he didn't need to trick the Welsh to do it. He could just do what he liked. No one, Welsh or otherwise, was in any kind of a position to challenge him. Also, it's a matter of historical record that Edward was appointed Prince of Wales in 1301, when he was 17. So not only was he not a baby, but he was perfectly capable of speaking English, and what's more, we believe he also spoke Welsh too, so every element of this tale is flawed. That doesn't mean to say that all the legends we have are equally flawed. We have a great one that tells us about Edward's inept flight across South Wales. It's not fully explained how or why, but somehow he and Despenser managed to get to Neath, where they sought refuge at the Abbey. They recruited the abbot there to go to Isabella to plead terms for Edward's surrender and safe passage. The story goes that the arrival of the Abbot of Neath broadcasted quite blatantly that Edward and Despenser were probably hiding out in Neath Abbey. Yeah, I can sort of see that. Realising he'd blown their cover, the abbot managed to get word to them to flee. So they decide to take the Glamorgan Ridgeway route east from Morien to try and get back to Caerphilly. We have a fantastic account of what happened on that route, which was published in the South Wales Daily News on the 29th of August 1899 by a man from the hilltop village of Llangynwyd near Maesetg, who called himself Cadrawd. He claimed that he had uncovered a genuine historic account written by a bard called Morien. Let me read that to you. Cadrawd writes, "While in hiding from his enemies at Llangynwyd, in order to keep up his character as a Welsh peasant, Edward accepted employment as a thresher of corn at the farm, where he was afforded temporary shelter from the fury of Isabella and Mortimer. The farmer, meanwhile, keeping watch for suspicious characters in the locality, should any such characters appear, the fugitive king hid himself in the branches of an oak tree nearby, afterwards known as Cadair Edward, whence he saw on several occasions boards of soldiers in search of him." The legend then goes on to describe how when Edward was ready to leave his hiding place, he and the farmer went on an almighty drinking spree in the local tavern, where the king was able to demonstrate his proficiency in speaking and singing in Welsh and playing local instruments, before setting off. The legend ends, however, with something of a bombshell. It reads, "In Bridgend, a contemporary brought to light another interesting find. This find places beyond a shadow of doubt the truth of one at least of Morien's statements. An inscribed stone is said to be the find which sets forth the fact that Edward II did really and actually come to the farm of Llangynwyd. After centuries we are told that the stone has been revealed by the hand of nature herself, by the blowing down of the old tree." Now, obviously the story has a lot of overtones of the one about Charles I hiding in the royal oak. However, there is one inescapable fact in all of this. There genuinely is a stone. You need to work quite hard to find it these days, but it is there. So does that prove the story to be true? I had to investigate further, and following Edward II's lead, I debunked to a local boozer, in this instant the old house in Llangynwyd, where I asked Bill Howells, archivist at the Llantrisant Valley History Society, for an explanation.
If you went inland from wherever he was, either Morien Abbey or Neath Abbey, he would have come into the parish of Llangynwyd.
Right.
Now then, did he believe he could find some sort of refuge, either with Llangynwyd Castle, which is just half a mile from where we're speaking now? The record shows that the castle, in fact, was destroyed in 1295 by a raid by Morgan Ap Cadrawd. But he may have thought it was still standing and he get some sort of support there, or he was aware that his steward in this area, which was called Tirialch at the time, the Earl's Land, his steward then was a man called Maesetg. In fact, he was involved in the Llywelyn Bren revolt. but he was captured and actually was thrown into the Tower of London, but later pardoned by Edward to return to his duties to look after the land, because this was a very favourite hunting area for the earls, etc., the Norman earls. So it's either one or two of those reasons. He sought refuge here or rest before he continued on his onward journey to Caerphilly, which he never made, as we know, because he was captured before that. But the local story says that having failed that, he actually sought refuge in a small farm called Berkeley Eleno. So is the story true? There's no reason why it shouldn't be true. It's perfectly logical. And if you look at the map, you'll find that Neath Abbey, Llangynwyd Parish, Tonyrefael and Caerphilly Castle are basically in a straight line. Back in the Victorian era, there was a historian called Thomas Christopher Evans who lived just in the village here. He was a famous historian, and he was a member of the Gorthset of Baths and had the bardic name of Cadrawd. He also had a small quarry up on the hillside just above us here. And we believe, it's not in the record, but we believe that he ordered a stone to be cut out and placed on the site of the tree.
Fly in the ointment. Man who wrote newspaper article, owned a quarry and ordered the stone himself, and then wrote about it, saying that it was the absolute inexcusable truth of the matter. Rather typical, unfortunately, of this period of history, that we get something like that. So an historian in the mould of Glamorgan, evidently. So look, Edward was following the ancient Ridgeway. Now, that road is so old, the Romans describe it as ancient when they discovered it. And funnily enough, I've already made a film about that, talking in the context of its links to King Arthur. So if you haven't already seen that, subscribe to this channel and it will make finding it a lot easier. But I digress. Fact is, the Ridgeway is a perfectly logical route for Edward to take, especially if he's trying to get from Neath to Caerphilly by avoiding the castles of Coity and Bridgend and the fortified towns of Cowbridge and Cardiff, all of which would have been full of soldiers trying to hunt him down. And all of those places lie on the southern route, which crosses South Wales from east to west, the old Roman road known as the Via Julia Maritima, which these days is mostly under the A48. The Ridgeway, of course, passes through Llangynwyd and then proceeds to Llantrisant, which is where he was captured. Now, we know that at this point in history, one part of this road would have had a lot of traffic on it, as it was used by a pilgrimage route to the holy shrine at Penrhys. And it's on that part, just outside Llantrisant, at a village known as Pant-y-Brad, where Morien's legend has Edward being pursued through a storm across the Rhondda Valley by baying dogs, eventually being captured by agents of Mortimer on the 16th of November 1326. And here we find yet another stone to commemorate the event. Now, do you think the information on this stone is accurate? I had to run it by John Barry Davis, president of the Llantrisant and District Local History Society, for his take on it.
Well, Morien, of course, was a great romantic. He was a historian in the Glamorgan tradition.
Right.
Once he had if a theory got into his head, it immediately became an established historical fact,
Right.
to the point of putting a plaque
Right.
at the spot where this is supposed to have happened.
Okay.
And once he put the plaque there, of course, everyone is bound to think, aren't they, that it is an historical fact.
Yes.
Why did he pick on Pant-y-Brad as the thing? In the late 17th century, the tradition was that Pant-y-Brad was where a certain Cadwgan of Aberkeley in Ystrad was captured. And that was during the time of the Wars of Independence of Llangynwyd. So there is a long tradition of interpreting the place name of Pant-y-Brad. Yeah, the national schools and the British schools too, the independent schools, their mission in life, of course, was to initially forestall a potential revolution in the early 19th century.
Yeah.
And their mission here, in particular, I think would have been to rubbish too much anti-Sison legend and replace it with something more wholesome with a proper understanding of the greatest empire that had ever existed. And Llantrisant, of course, the importance of Llantrisant in this it was the castle. Yes. It was the centre of two lordships, right. Maesetg and Rhondda. So that anything that happened anywhere, if this capture had taken place anywhere in the region of Rhondda, I mean right up the Rhondda, anywhere, that would be near Llantrisant Castle. Right. Because it's to Llantrisant Castle they would have brought. So being near Llantrisant Castle doesn't mean that it has to be just down the road.
So, yet another unreliable stone. Unfortunately, in this period in history, here in South Wales, we had a plethora of people who, let's just say, were creative with history. The one we all know about is Iolo Morgannwg, of course, because he got imprisoned for fraudulently replicating historical documents. But unfortunately, he was not alone. Anyway, let's just get back to the plot. So, things are not looking brilliant for either Edward or Despenser. Although dealing with Despenser is obviously going to be a lot more straightforward. So, he was separated from his king and lover, taken to Hereford, where he was hung, drawn and quartered. The same thing he had inflicted upon Llywelyn Bren was now inflicted upon him. But what to do with the king? Isabella and Mortimer were far from home and dry. Edward, after all, was still king, anointed by God, and even though they were few and far between, he still had supporters and loyal subjects. This is the extent of the pursuit that Isabella and Mortimer had to put in order to capture him. So he was held prisoner at a succession of castles, including Monmouth and Ledbury, but for relatively brief periods. Always fearful that he would be discovered and broken free, Isabella and Mortimer kept him moving, eventually settling on Kenilworth as the place he would be forced to abdicate in favour of his son. Now, it seems that he did so without much of a fuss, and his son was so grateful to him that it is reported that while at Kenilworth, between December 1326 and April 1327, he sent his father a gift of 2 tons of Rhenish wine. Edward's incarceration on Kenilworth was relatively short-lived, and by April 1327 he was brought here to Berkeley Castle. And I think we all know what happened next, don't we?
So we have a lot of accounts from the various manors that made up the Berkeley estate, from the time when Isabella and Mortimer were looking for Edward after he'd fled into Wales. There are lots of accounts for things like damage that was done by their men. There are a couple of new locks for barn doors and that sort of thing. And that's all sort of about the autumn of 1326. And then Edward is brought here, and we know exactly when he arrived because there's an entry in the accounts that says that he arrived at dinner time on Palm Sunday in 1327, which will have been about mid-afternoon, and it was the 5th of April. So we know pretty much exactly when he turned up, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then from then until July, he's more or less looked after as an honoured guest. He has his own household. He's got people to cook for him. He's got a cook and a kitchen. He's got people to look after his horses. He's got a personal servant, and all of this turns up in the accounts because there are lots of entries for things like oats for his horses and meat and grain and so on for his kitchen. And interestingly, he's referred to always as the king's father, not as the king, because technically he's abdicated in favour of his little son Edward, who becomes Edward III, and he was still a child at the time. So the Berkeley family are connected to the Mortimers. Maurice Lord Berkeley's son, Thomas, is married to Margaret Mortimer, who is Roger Mortimer's daughter. And Maurice and Thomas have been imprisoned earlier, and then they're released. Maurice dies in 1326, so Thomas inherits, and it is Thomas Lord Berkeley who is responsible for being Edward's jailer. here at Berkeley Castle. And so he's obviously not going to be calling him the king, because so as far as he's concerned, Edward III is the king. So there are lots of entries to do with him having his own household here and being, it sounds like he was looked after pretty well. And then some of his supporters break him out in the July of 1327. And after he's brought back, his condition definitely become worse, as it were. He's definitely being kept as a prisoner. We've got, again, entries in the accounts for the wages of 9 men to spend a day blocking up a door, which one might guess had been broken down when they were getting him out. We've got entries in the accounts for new locks and iron bars, and basically reinforcing the fortifications of the castle.
So initially, at least, it looks like Edward was well treated at both Kenilworth and Berkeley, but after he'd been broken out and recaptured, things changed. Holding Edward prisoner was clearly becoming too big a risk, and some kind of a permanent solution needed to be found. But how to do that? Well, that's a tricky, particularly if you believe that he was anointed by God. It's easy to forget how, back then, kings were, by very religious people, believed to be second only to God. We have 2 reported possibilities of how Edward met his maker. Not one of them, incidentally, contemporary.
We come up to the 21st of September, I believe, in 1327, and although there isn't anything in the accounts to do with Edward's death, we do have a history of the Berkeley family, which was written about 300 years later, in about 1620s, 1630s, by a guy called John Smith, who was the right-hand man of the Lord Berkeley of the time. And he's writing this history of the family as kind of a textbook for George Lord Berkeley, because he's inherited from his grandfather when he was really quite young. And I think John Smith felt that he needed to know all about all of his great and illustrious forebears, so he writes him this great long account of all of the important members of the family, and he includes, obviously, Edward's captivity and murder here.
They rushed in the night time into his chamber and smothered him with great and heavy feather beds, and then this is the bit that made Danny Dyer say things. Thrusting an hollow instrument like the end of a trumpet or glister pipe into his fundament, and threw it a red-hot iron up into his bowels, whereby he ended his life with a lamentable loud cry heard by many both of the town and the castle.
Right. So
yeah,
when was that? Because when was that written in relation to?
So this was written about 300 years later, but
right.
He's taking as his source Geoffrey Le Baker's Chronicle, which was written 20 or 30 years after the event, and it was, I suppose, it was kind of in the chronicler's interests to be a bit interesting. Let's just put it that way, a bit.
Sex it up a bit,
lurid,
to quote more recent history.
Yes.
So 2 modes of execution, smothering and the red-hot poker story. Which one is true?
Edward, some months later then, Edward Sr. was taken down to Berkeley, where he was killed, probably smothered, and not by the infamous red-hot poker, which everyone seems to love that story, don't they? They're really doing it now.
And he writes that he names the men as well, that they came into his cell and that they smothered him. But he does also repeat the old chestnut, one might say, about the red-hot poker in The Unfortunate Place, which it's pretty much word for word what they say in various of the chronicles that were written in the 1300s, but quite important to note, I think, not immediately after the event. So there may well have been some embroidering going on.
Believe it or not, there is actually a third option. There is a tale told that he was in fact smuggled out of the country by his loving son, and he got to live out the rest of his life in Italy. And there are even claims of documents that prove this. I wonder what Karen has to say about that.
Well, it's interesting. It's certainly interesting. My predecessor was a great scholar of Edward II, and he has had a look at one of the principal sources for this rumour, which is a letter or a copy of a letter which has been written into the cartulary of the bishops of Maguelone in southern France, I believe. And a cartulary is a book containing carefully written up copies of all of the important documents that relate to the institution that's keeping it, so that if you need to refer to something, you can just get it straight out, rather than having to rummage through all the boxes looking for the individual document. And this letter, which purports to be from a papal notary called Manuel de Fieschi, written to Edward III, and it purports to be an account of a confession made by Edward II, allegedly, in Italy. And it's been copied out with some sort of funny things that made my predecessor as archivist here, David Smith, think that it was a copy of a draft of a letter. Because the copyist has faithfully reproduced crossings out and little indications that words are to be omitted, that sort of thing. And it's not dated, which documents of this date, letters certainly would be dated. And also, it's not entirely in the very formal Latin that would be expected if you're writing to somebody very important at the time. The king and on behalf of the Pope and all of that. And there are lots of little sort of vernacular phrases that are not proper Latin. And what David thinks was going on was that what you have to understand is, at the time, Edward, in about the late 1330s, Edward III is preparing to invade France, which becomes the beginning of what is later known as the 100 Years' War. And he is visiting Germany in about 1338, trying to make some alliances, drum up a bit of support. And the Pope of the time very much doesn't want this to happen. So the idea is that this letter has been written basically to discredit Edward III and put off the main potential ally, who was Ludwig of Bavaria. And it's to make Ludwig think, oh, this chap's father's still alive. He's not legitimately, genuinely king because his dad's still alive and wandering around in Italy. And at the time, there was a chap called William the Welshman who was, I think, going around France claiming to be Edward II. So it's sort of building on that to undermine Edward III's credibility with his potential allies, to hopefully put him off invading France.
Yeah,
and
so if Edward is alive,
he's the
Edward
king.
III is not the legitimate king.
Yes, exactly.
Therefore, an allegiance with an illegitimate king is
Yeah.
allegiance to nothing.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
political suicide.
Yep.
Yeah.
Not a good idea.
No.
But we think that the letter probably wasn't sent because there's no other record of it anywhere. There's nothing in the Royal Archives. There's nothing. It only exists as this copy. We don't have the original, or they don't have the original. There is just this copy in this cartulary, this book of important documents.
Yes.
So it's probably not true.
So, whichever theory you subscribe to, he was finally laid to rest in this rather beautiful tomb, which now stands in Gloucester Cathedral. Although people who favour the lived out his years in Italy theory will back the fact that it took 30 years after his claimed death for this tomb to be built. But if I'm absolutely honest, I'd say that's probably because keeping the king's death under wraps was probably a bit of a priority. Didn't want to make a big fuss. It wasn't until there was absolutely no question of Edward III's legitimacy being questioned that they wanted to make a big deal about his tomb. But Edward III did, I think, love his father and did want to have a fitting tomb built. So hence us getting this. There's one other tomb in all of this that is definitely worth a mention. And that is a small grave that stands outside the walls of the graveyard at Neath Abbey, a lone grave. And the legend has it that this is the grave of the Abbot of Neath, who inadvertently gave away the location of the king when he was in hiding. And many people have interpreted that as betrayal. So because he was so racked with guilt for having betrayed his king, He left orders that on his death he should not have the privilege of being buried amongst his peers. So let's pull together all these loose strands to bring some kind of a conclusion. There are many parts to this story. Part of them being questions of identity. One obvious question a lot of people ask is, was Edward II gay? I suppose, as much as we believe Despenser and Galveston were the king's lovers, we also believe that he fathered 5 illegitimate children through mistresses, possibly more. So I suppose bisexual might be a more likely explanation. Then there's a lot of questions of national identity. Having a prince of the English crown appointed to the office of Prince of Wales is still controversial even now. But how English was Edward really? He was born in Caernarfon, he spoke Welsh, so if he was a decent prop, the selectors could have called him up to play in red. He and his father may have been kings of England, but they had more French antecedents than anything else. So he could have just as easily played in white or for Le Bleu. And of course his mother was Spanish, so where does that leave us? I think his identity being so definitively described as an English Prince of Wales in later history has always been one motivated by politics, either by English nationalists to demonstrate claims of English supremacy or Welsh nationalists to demonstrate claims of colonialisation. But in reality, just like his sexual orientation, the lines are definitely blurred. But whoever he was, and however he identified, he was always be remembered as an unpopular king in a turbulent time whose decision-making was cataclysmically bad, and eventually that caught up with him. And to summarise, this Welsh-born but English Prince of Wales fled to Wales to escape from the French Queen of England, but was eventually killed in a castle in England built by Saxons to keep out the Welsh. Have you kept up with all that? Good. Simples.
I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to learn more about Welsh history, then please subscribe to this channel. There's a new video uploaded at least once a month, and they're always about things that will have happened somewhere on your doorstep. There's always so much to discuss. Subscribe to the channel, get early notifications. Look, until the next time we meet, enjoy your history.